Hello everyone, my name is Kevin Wang, and today I'm going to be talking about my experience teaching at a small Polish university during my Fulbright scholarship. And you may be wondering why I'm not sharing a Zoom recording of the talk. The reason for that is because I wasn't super clear about communicating a pause in the middle of the talk, and I guess it just sounded like that was supposed to be under the talk, so the Zoom recording from Friday is just for the first half of the talk. So I wanted to make a complete recording that is of the entire talk. I got my rubber duck over here so that I feel like I'm actually talking to something. And yeah, let's go ahead and do this. Also, I apologize in advance for any audio stuff. I think I have a fan in the background that might be picked up by the microphone. Also, my keyboard is really loud, so when I advance to the next slide, it's gonna be like a boom in your ear. But anyway, hopefully that is not too disruptive. So, hello and dzień dobry for those of you who speak Polish. I did both my bachelor's and my master's at Michigan, and right now I am a PhD student at the University of British Columbia. I did a bunch of stuff, but sort of what I want to focus on is my Fulbright scholarship that I did immediately after my time at Michigan, where I was teaching English and computer science in a small Polish university. So on the top left there, you can see that's me with former U.S. Ambassador to Poland, Mark Brzezinski. The other photos are of cities around Poland, and in the center you see me with my fellow Fulbright teachers. What a fun photo. And today I'm going to be talking specifically about teaching and service in computer science. And I would like you to think of this as me sharing experiences rather than some expert telling you this is how teaching and service work. Because I am only 24 and I don't consider myself an expert on anything yet. Questions and comments would be welcome throughout if this is a live talk, and do take this with an appropriate amount of salt. This is an appropriate amount of salt. Okay. So right away I should apologize for a little bit of false advertising because this is less about Poland and more, as I mentioned, about um, this school being a small, under-resourced local university. And before I get into discussing the school, I want to just share some photos from the city to show you that this is a real city that people live in and it's got its own things going on. As I talk about my experience, I'm going to be very honest about my experiences with the students, faculty, admin, including some stuff that is going to sound pretty critical. And it's important to me that you see those students, faculty, and admin as real people with their own lives and problems and things going on, rather than just reducing them solely to their educational role or how good or how bad they might be at certain aspects of teaching or learning. Because it is fundamentally unfair to me to leverage critiques of a school like this from where I'm sitting at Michigan. Well, technically UBC right now, but it's not a fair apples to apples comparison. And I want you to keep in mind that these are that it's not just about their educational quality per se. So, first, I want to give you some context about the university. This is a really small university. So when I taught EECS 280 in fall 22, winter 23, that year, those two semesters combined, there were more students in EECS 280 than there were students at this university total the year that I came. It's also a school that is younger than me, and the fact that it is younger than me means that it hasn't had a lot of time to establish traditions or best practices or sort of establish things. It's a university that is basically fighting for survival, and so the priority of admin and of university activities is on marketing and getting students in seats. As we'll see later, this sometimes comes at the expense of teaching quality. And it was a point of frustration for me early on when I didn't quite understand what was sort of the broader circumstances. On top of all of this, this is located in the least developed, poorest part of Poland. If you know Polish geography, this would be a voivodeship or the equivalent of a state or um, province, right? And this is the poorest voivodeship that the school is in. And the city that the school is in is relatively small, and it suffered a lot during World War II. First, the Soviets came in during the partition of Poland between Germany and Soviet Union, and they deported a lot of families and executed a lot of the intelligentsia. Then, when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, the city was largely destroyed, many families were killed, and most of the Jews living in the city died. If you imagine this happening in Ann Arbor in 1940 and thinking about the effect that would have on the school to this point, you can kind of see where this city and the university in the city is standing. And to some extent also the rest of Poland, although I think this city in particular suffered a lot um, during the war and during the Cold War period as well. Nonetheless, this university has a really important local role. One of the first things that the staff of the university showed me was this upstairs little science section where they had a lot of hands-on science thingamajigs for primary students to learn science in a hands-on way. Additionally, this is where a lot of local business people and entrepreneurs and other innovators come to discuss ideas. And I say all of this to preface what I would say is a very honest assessment of the university based on my experience teaching. So, when I got to this university, I sat there for 2 weeks because I didn't have course assignments. That is to say, they did not have a plan for what courses I was going to teach in computer science, even though they knew that I was coming several months ago. And once that was resolved, I was never given a full teaching role, which is what Fulbright says is what you're supposed to do. Instead, I was kind of a TA for a bunch of different classes. They didn't have TA positions, so I was kind of like filling the role of a TA for a school that didn't have TAs. As I mentioned before, there was a big focus on marketing and getting students in seats rather than teaching. To give you an illustrative example, on day 3 of me being at the school, I was invited to meet the rector, or sort of the president of the school, and because I still didn't have classes, I was like, oh, okay, so this must be where I get classes, like, assigned to me, right? And it's not where I got classes assigned to me. Instead, it was a really awkward interview with the rector, and then they took pictures of me and posted them on social media, and they were like, hey, we got this cool American dude, and it was just a marketing thing. And again, back then I didn't understand the importance of the marketing thing, and so I was just sitting there like, why would you do this when I haven't even gotten my teaching assignments yet? Come on. Separately, later on, as I actually started teaching, I learned from fellow faculty that what the school would tell faculty to do is to pass students who are failing to make sure that there are enough students in the major for the major to survive and for the school to keep getting funding. So that's you can imagine that Michigan would probably not do that. Overall, there was not a lot of coordination. I was kind of left on my own. Part of this is my fault, but um, it still stands that there wasn't a lot of effort put into the coordination in the first place by the faculty or the admin. And I wasn't happy with a lot of this. And when in November of that year, when I had my last class for the semester, and there were 2 or 3 months left in the semester for teaching, I was pretty displeased because it felt like I was being sidelined and that I was not given serious teaching duties and that there wasn't real intent to actually have me teach and do service at this university. So I talked to Fulbright. Fulbright talked with the school, and then shortly after Fulbright talked with the school, I ran into a computer science professor who came to talk to me basically on the verge of tears, saying that his hours for teaching were being reallocated from him to me so that I could get classes to teach. And I said, "Oh my god, that's not what I meant. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." And he said, "No, I am sorry that we are not giving you the time of day." And I was like, "No, no, 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 no. This is I don't want to screw over the careers of people at the university for the sake of my Fulbright experience." And so it became this whole political quagmire, me pushing back to get more of what I wanted. And I decided against pushing back more than this because I didn't want to negatively affect the other teachers in the program. Um, because I was just going to be there for the year. I didn't want to cause long term damage to someone's career by trying to take their hours or something like that. That becomes more relevant later on. On actually teaching, the big thing that came up to me that was distinct from Michigan was that there were relatively negative attitudes towards students. In general, when things went wrong, students were blamed. Students were not enthusiastic enough, or students didn't know the material enough, things like that. Additionally, there was very little opportunity to interact with students outside of class. For example, there were no clubs, no extracurriculars, no teaching assistantships, no research. Most classes didn't even have real office hours. Usually they would have an office hours listed, but students would just never show up. There were also a couple of problematic teachers. The case that stands out the most was that there was a teacher teaching 1 4-hour course every week, and for 30 minutes to an hour of that class, he would go on about how sexual deviants are ruining Poland, and by sexual deviants, he meant LGBTQ individuals. That was the most extreme example. There were also, in general, a lot of teachers who students told me didn't seem that enthusiastic or didn't seem to have a complete grasp of material that they were teaching, things like that. One thing I also want to point out is that there was a low emphasis on project based work. Originally, I had this listed as an issue, but it was pointed out to me that this is more of a difference in teaching style, and it's not exclusive to the small university in Poland. It's also something you see more broadly in Europe. For example, in Paris, I met a student at a Parisian school who said that the master's students in the computer science program at that school are required to take topology. I have never used topology. I have a computer science master's from Michigan, so there's clearly just a difference in prioritization there. And you see a lot of really strong theory work coming from Europe. So it does have payoffs, even if it doesn't quite match the style that we're used to in the US. So I say the first thing I want to say in terms of all these issues I'm pointing out, right? I want to emphasize how many more resources and institutional knowledge Michigan has compared to most institutions around the world. Well, the problems listed on the slide, right? Like, most of these problems are problems that Michigan avoids for some reason or another. And because Michigan dodges these issues, you can do things at Michigan that are just way too hard to accomplish at other schools in a reasonable manner. I say this not to be like, oh, Michigan is so good, but to remind you, one, what does sort of a typical education look like, right? There are 250 million undergrads around the world. Michigan hosts somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 of them, Michigan's education, the education you get at Michigan is not representative of the education you get at most schools in the world. And when you leave Michigan and encounter people who come from different backgrounds, I really want you to keep that in mind. Not as a lording over other people kind of thing, but just acknowledging where you stand versus where other people stand. I also want to say this because I have met a lot of people at Michigan who put themselves or put other Michigan students down really aggressively. Um, and it's not to say that Michigan is perfect necessarily, but if you're at Michigan, you have done pretty well to get in, and you have access to a lot of resources and opportunities that are much stronger than the opportunities that you might see at other schools. In particular, right, when sometimes I see students at Michigan wishing that they got into Stanford or CMU or schools like that, right? From where I was teaching in Poland, there is no difference between those schools. They are all incredibly well resourced schools of really talented students, and they're all punching way above where my small school in Poland was placing. As I say this, I also want to say attending Michigan doesn't mean that you automatically succeed. Michigan does have its own issues, and some of those issues do come from the level of procedure that it has. But more generally, even if Michigan is providing these resources and opportunities, you are the one making use of them, and you are in control of um, your success, even if Michigan is giving you these opportunities. So, moving on to the students. As I mentioned before, many of the teachers said that the students had issues, and from working with the students, that was true to some extent for a lot of students. I had students who just didn't pay attention, students who didn't try very hard on problems, students who would just kind of stare into space when I asked questions to try and get them to participate, things like that. The way this was explained to me by faculty members is that you have free tuition, you have sort of a lack of direction from the student perspective. A lot of students come in just saying, okay, college is sort of the default next step, so I'm just going to go to college. And there's not a lot of intention behind what to do in college or what to do with that degree. At a school like Michigan, those students would probably have to wake up very quickly. But at this small Polish university that's trying to get as many students in seats, those students are not pushed harder because the school just needs every single student it can get. And so the outcome that you see is that there's very little motivation among a lot of the students, and there's no consequences for failure or low performance because the school does not want to get rid of students who may be underperforming. Now, this was the reason given to me by a lot of the faculty and also some of the students, but I don't think that this is comprehensive because I did have good students. I've listed out a couple other reasons why students might be underperforming, but let me get to those good students. First, let me explain what I actually did. So I was teaching computer science mostly to the first year students. The lessons I made were pretty similar to the lessons that you would see in 183 or 280. I also did a couple of higher level lessons, but I was mostly sticking with the first years. One of the big things that I did in the first semester and also in the second semester was to create a coding club. And as I mentioned before, there was no extracurricular activity at this school to work on code with other students. And so I made this a priority because I have benefited a lot from extracurriculars. A lot of my friends and colleagues have benefited a lot from extracurriculars. And I thought this would be really important to put together. Additionally, because I was having issues At a political level, getting more time with students in courses, I felt like this was the next best thing, to spend more time with students outside of courses. A lot of the first year students showed up to that first club meeting. I think I had like I was anticipating like I was hoping for like 5 students to show up because it's generally quite hard to get students to show up to a club. Um, from my freshman class of 45 students or so, I had 15 or 20 students who showed up and crammed into that relatively small office while I tried to clumsily explain. I think it was Git was the first thing that I decided to explain in the club. Now, I made a pretty critical mistake here, sort of at the start of this club, and that mistake was that I gave students ideas on what to do and sort of turned it into another course rather than giving them the reins and letting them explore what they wanted to do. Um, and for various reasons, this was not super enthusiastic. Like, it was not super inspiring, and students lost enthusiasm. I also picked a project that ended up having issues due to some of the hardware limitations that we had, and so we struggled to produce results initially. This led to a lot of frustration and a lot of students dropping out of the club. And so I ended up with 5 or 6 students who were still very interested and still willing to learn and try to make things despite the mistakes that I made. From that point on, I sort of said, hey, you have a couple of really strong, motivated students here. I'm going to appoint 2 leaders. You guys go do what you're interested in, and I'm going to pay for pizza and just mentor in the background. And so the value that I actually provided to the club was less about lessons or additional like technical support. It was that I was this figure who had challenged them and pushed them in class, told them that they could make stuff, gave them a space to make stuff and a group to sort of make stuff together with, and paying for pizza. The contribution that I had was much less about technical things and much more about the sort of motivation and giving them a space. To list out a couple of the accomplishments at that club, on the left you see the first game that they put together, and this was a parody of a game called Getting Over It, where the narrator makes fun of you and says a bunch of philosophical stuff as you try to climb a mountain, and they kind of riffed off of that. The year after I left, they cooperated with the business students at the university to put in a submission for a competition called Enactus Poland, which is a nationwide sort of business for good competition. They placed third nationwide, and it is incredible to me that they placed third nationwide because they had very little input from faculty, and they had been around for less than a year when they like had placed at this competition in third place in the entire country. I should say that this is third out of seventh, so it's not as crazy as say like third out of 100 necessarily, but it's still crazy to me that they managed to do this while having whatever resources they had, and also while competing with universities around the country who had much more robust resources and much longer traditions of actually working on this stuff. On the right, you see a game that they put together to advertise the club the year after I left again. You see multiplayer, you got 3D graphics, you got controller input, and that's a pretty sophisticated jump from the game on the left that was done the year that I was there. This gets me to my second point, which is that you find high quality people in basically everywhere, and in a lot of unexpected places, like this small rural school at Poland. Not everywhere is going to be able to support those people, right? As I mentioned before, Michigan has a ton of opportunities and resources to support students who are motivated. This university in Poland that I taught at just didn't have the same things, and not all of those are that university's fault. In an alternate world where my students were able to attend Michigan somehow, I think they would have done incredibly well at Michigan. I think they would have gotten a lot done. I think that, I mean, you could be hearing a presentation from them instead of me. And it leads me to a belief that students do not deserve to do worse because they went to a worse school. Sure, if you have a worse school, then like maybe you could point that to a lack of motivation when they're young, or like low performance when they're young, right? But the point is that you still see these really high quality students at these places that are not as good as a school like Michigan, and I think that we should let them do well as far as we can, even if they are at these weaker schools. This gets to a concept that I called intelligence in the wild, which is basically just book smarts versus street smarts. Intelligence in the wild says that you should evaluate how capable someone is based on how they use their abilities and how they combine everything they learned, rather than just directly assessing the abilities. My students in Poland, who I thought were really strong, had this intelligence in the wild quality. They were able to find interesting problems, put together cool things, all without me needing to say, you need to do this to put all of these things together. That's a kind of skill that's really valuable in the real world, and I think as teachers, that's a kind of skill that we should be emphasizing. Actually, emphasizing this is hard, especially when you're working at the scale of Michigan, but I want to say it nonetheless this is because I think this is what we should emphasize. Also, it's something that you should emphasize for your own learning and for your own career growth, for that matter. Now, we aren't. Sorry if you hear my tummy growling, by the way. It's a little bit late at night. Um, Now, we aren't necessarily the best at actually finding these people who have this intelligence in the wild. This quote from Esker Dijkstra is describing the timeline of the Multics operating system that was being built at MIT back in the 60s. This was one of the first operating systems, and they were having this issue called deadlock, where the operating system would just sometimes freeze up. And Dijkstra had put together a solution to this thing called the dining philosopher's problem, which was in turn a solution for deadlock. Now, this solution to the dining philosopher's problem, this was a solution that was put out a few years before MIT even started working on the Multics operating system. And still, MIT had this issue of deadlock, even though the solution was out there. The thing is that when Dijkstra did this, he was at the Eindhoven University of Technology, the second university on that list below his name. And MIT is just generally not going to look at a school like Eindhoven when they're looking for innovative, cutting edge solutions to computer science problems. And in general, this is hard for MIT or Michigan, or for that matter, Google, Microsoft, what have you. It is hard for organizations to find the best people in every single place, because they don't have the resources to look everywhere. And so those places will tend to bias towards reputable places like MIT, Michigan, Google, Microsoft, or whatever, um, because that serves as a proxy for quality. It doesn't mean that it actually is quality, right? You have Michigan students who are not as strong as Dykstra. I mean, like, I'm a Michigan alumni. I'm not as smart as Dykstra. And you have professors at the Eindhoven University of Technology, and for that matter, scientists and engineers from all sorts of obscure places who are really strong and way above the bar of the average Michigan alum. Now, that being said, I don't want this to simply be about comparing the best and the best to each other. I also want to say that you don't need to be Dijkstra in order to contribute to the field. My personal belief is that there should be room for everyone in computer science and software engineering, because there's so many problems out there that need solving. This isn't actually how it works in practice because you have limited resources. Particularly for university admissions, you can only admit so many people. Companies can only hire so many people. And even if you did have more resources, there's still the problem of choosing which problems to work on, which is also tricky. And even if you did know, um, you may not necessarily pick all of the beneficial problems because it depends on your incentives. In particular, for the case of university admissions and for employment, we often talk about meeting some sort of bar for quality, and fact is that you're just not gonna have everyone at that bar. Now, I think that you should work with people who are below that bar and try as hard as you can to get them over, but it's hard when you have limited resources. When I say this, I'm thinking a lot about both my students in Poland as well as students who I taught at Michigan who um, really wanted to learn but just didn't have the foundations. And it's easy for teachers to say you don't have the foundations, just, you know, you need to go do something else or something like that. Um, and I want to work as a teacher. I want to work with those students and get them above that bar, and fill in those foundations for them. It's not possible when you have a class of 2,000 students like EECS 280. Well, they're not at 2,000 students right now, but it's nonetheless it's still not possible to do this at the scale of some of the classes at Michigan. I still want to, and I say that because that is important to me as a teacher. Now, the year after I left, the incoming class size for computer science was 15 students. And when I talk about the university having this focus on PR, marketing, getting students in seats, and how I didn't appreciate that, this is why they had that focus. Because it's really, really hard to get things going with a computer science class of only 15 students. I don't know what the future holds for this university, if this is the enrollment that they have. Particularly for those of you who are newer teachers, I want to say that there's going to be issues outside your control. Fundamentally, you're just not going to be able to succeed with every student because you don't control every parameter that influences a student's success. In the same way that doctors will not save every patient, lawyers will not win every case, us teachers are not going to be able to make every student succeed. And that's just a fact of being in a profession. This was a frustrating year. As you can tell, like there were a lot of things that I was really annoyed at and that I wish were done better. That being said, I do think that I got a lot out of this because I feel like I got a really good experience at Michigan as a student and as a teacher. And if I had never done this, then I would have thought that I could have thought that that was normal and that was just the standard everywhere. By going to teach at this small, under-resourced university in Poland, I got a better idea of what education looks like in other places. And the upshot for me, the thing that I was thinking of as I flew back from Warsaw to Detroit was that my value and my potential in my career is not strictly associated with my alma mater. It is in the sense that Michigan has given me so many opportunities and resources to accomplish what I wanted to accomplish. But at the end of the day, when I look at the students at my small Polish university who succeeded in spite of their circumstances, I look at myself and I also say, even though I had all these resources, it is also true that I was the one making use of them. And I think you could make a comparison between the two of like, okay, who was actually overcoming more obstacles because who went higher and like who went higher relative to the resources that they had. Um, Not that I think that comparison is productive, but um, the point that stands is that you are the one who is most responsible for your success. As I say all of this, I also want to say that it's okay if you're at Michigan and you have all these opportunities and you're still struggling, because life is not as simple as, oh, this place has all these resources and opportunities, so you should just succeed. It's not that simple. I I feel like in this presentation sometimes I make it sound like that, but I want to emphasize that it's not that simplistic, and it's okay if you are having a hard time right now, even if you are at a good school like Michigan. Now, there was a Q&A section here, and I want to go over some of the points from the actual talk. One question was, what would you have done differently if you were admin? And my original answer was, it's just really hard because getting more students in seats with the resources you have available to you is just really hard at this school. But I would also say that looking at the system in place would be worthwhile, because if you're trying to draw students away, if you're trying to draw strong students away from some of the more traditional choices like the University of Warsaw or Jagiellonian, um, then I would think that you would want to provide something different that those stronger schools might not provide. For example, as I mentioned before, Europe tends to be more theory focused. What if this school sold itself by having a project based curriculum for computer science? I don't think it's that simple. I think the job for admin is still really hard, but a thinking about the system again, I think is worthwhile. There was another point brought up about how students might be less motivated at this small Polish university because the perceived value of the degree is lower. I think that is true to some extent. If you are attending Michigan, then you expect, then you off like a lot of students expect rather that the degree at Michigan gets them better job prospects. However, that's not strictly what motivates every student. Some students are there because they want to learn and they're motivated by what they're learning rather than necessarily, um, rather than just the employment prospects. And I would say that the students who are very enthusiastic about the subject and who are motivated to learn the subject rather than solely by the career outcomes of the degree are the ones who tend to do really, really well. Additionally, I think degrees never give you guarantees of job prospects, especially in this current climate. And so I would be careful about viewing the value of degree as the main source of student motivation. On the third point, and I would like to say thank you to the one student who attended who had Polish parents. Um, Students in Poland take exams to enter high school, and from high school, take exams to enter college. So, which specific high school you go to has significant influence on later learner outcomes and where those students go to, like how the students perform on their college exams and sort of where they end up going to college. Additionally, there's a lot of students who will be accepted to good schools, but like quote unquote good schools in Poland, but who choose to stay home due to the cost of moving to those other schools. And indeed, for my city, which I mentioned was one of the poorer cities in the country, this is what I heard from a lot of students. Lastly, Gen AI is, the talk and everything, and it ended up being a subject in this talk as well. I don't have too much to say here other than that an under-resourced school will of course struggle more with a problem like Gen AI than a school like Michigan. Michigan has, or rather, a school that is trying to survive and trying to get students in seats and is trying to get a handle on that very, very high priority problem is going to have a hard time with this additional problem of Gen AI compared to a school like Michigan. All right. So, with that, I want to proceed and talk a bit about um, things that you might want to work on if you are really motivated by this idea of computer science for social good. And before I get into this, I want to emphasize that I am, again, not an expert. The main thing I wanted to do with this talk was to communicate this experience I had in this small Polish university. I'm going to give suggestions on things that you can do if you are inspired by this and you want to do social good yourself in some way. But I'm not necessarily like a huge social activist or someone who has done a lot of um, resume item social good, so to speak. And so, again, take things with a suitable amount of salt. As a teacher, I'm quite biased here, but I think that's the quote unquote easiest thing as a student of Michigan that you can do is to teach. You don't need to be a TA necessarily. You can create educational content and share what you have learned with others in a publicly accessible way. This is what I did when I first got into teaching. I was on a TA in 2020. In 2020, I was creating educational content for the Michigan Student AI Lab, which is a student organization on campus that is focused on AI research. So that's how I got into teaching. And if you're really interested in doing something good for the world, then doing something like this, like creating teaching material, educational material, is, I think, a great place to start. I would also like to emphasize that it's really important for us to teach people who aren't doing computer science for a career. I don't think that the education for this is super good for people who are not doing computer science. And it's particularly tricky because of how much influence certain topics of computer science have around society in general. Case in point, this is a quote from a representative who was part of regulatory hearings on Facebook in 2018. Now, for those of you who don't know, Representative Michael Burgess from Texas was a gynecologist for 25 years before becoming a politician and participating in this committee for regulation on Facebook. Now, there were results from this hearing. Mostly Facebook got fines and Cambridge Analytica went bankrupt. But I would like to posit the question, what else could have been done if the legislators who were part of this had an understanding of how Facebook works at a technical level and more generally how a social media platform works at a technical level? Maybe there's some stricter guidelines that have been put in place, or maybe there's other things that could have been done legislatively if these legislators knew more than the average 12-year-old on technology. And so I think it's a really important problem making this educational material for these people who aren't computer scientists. Making this content is quite hard. I would compare it closely to um, making content for students who are just getting into computer science. Although there are some key differences because you're not necessarily teaching only introductory content, and you also need to align with your students' expectations and their willingness to get into the weeds. I don't have great high level discussion beyond this because I think that this conversation really depends on what specific topic and what specific sort of stakeholders you are making this content for. Teaching is important to me because it's part of a broader vision that I have to democratize technology. And when I say democratize technology, I mean I want everyone to be able to access and use computers to improve the world, so to speak. Teaching is sort of an intellectual way to democratize technology because you teach people how to use the computers. But there's other aspects of this that are also really important. For example, my school in Poland was running Windows 7 on its computers because that was the most powerful operating system that those computers could support. And I think that hindered a lot of the activities that we try to do in class and in the club. And so I believe having access to high quality hardware and software is also really important in this sense. There's also questions about internet freedom and checks and balances on potential abuses of technology. Those are also important things when we're talking about democratizing technology. Now, I think those last two are their whole own research areas, and I am not really qualified to speak about them, but those are things that matter to me as part of this vision to democratize technology. Now, moving on from the teaching angle, we have a pretty rough reputation outside of computer science. It really is based on talking with people outside of computer science. We really do have this tech bro reputation where people think that we are in it for the money and that we don't really care about ethics. This discourages a lot of people from coming in, and it also means we get a lot of flack when uh, computers or software have negative consequences for society, which is not always 100% accurate. And addressing this, I think, is a pretty tricky problem. The big thing I want to emphasize is that we shouldn't just celebrate people who are very, very technically talented. When we have this kind of rockstar culture, it makes most people in the community feel down on themselves or um, like it's unhealthy for most people in the community if you have this rockstar culture. When I was in Poland, I got the opportunity to talk with someone at a very prominent video game studio in Warsaw, and the point that he made to me, the advice that he gave to me is like the minimum unit of value is the team. It should always be about the team. It's never about what a individual gets done. If you want to get something, if you want to do big things, then everything must be centered around the team. The way I would phrase it is that if you want to work with people, then work with people. I believe DEI is really important. I believe that allowing for diverse perspectives in computer science and diverse backgrounds is really important. And it's an easy thing to say. I think it's just a human tendency to exclude and to stick to people that we're comfortable with. But bringing in more perspectives, I think, can only help, especially if we want to think about the broader social impact of our work. And on that note, I also want to emphasize that we should, in my opinion, right, we should be emphasizing real world impact over just the raw technical ability a um, of an individual. Now, obviously, you need some level of technical ability in order to get things done, but what you actually get done is what other people see. Other people not in computer science, like other people in society. Even if you aren't super worried about the social impact conversation here, this is something that matters for your career in general. Results matter more than just raw abilities, which again gets back to that point that I made earlier about intelligence in the wild and how that is the skill you want to emphasize when you are um, when you're thinking about what you contribute. Now, there's a lot of broader social problems that go beyond just computers, and there's a question of can we, as computer scientists, also change the world? Generally, I don't see this happen. Generally, I see the example in this comic where you have these really talented people graduating from computer science programs, and most of them go do whatever makes the most money. So the question then arises like, how could we change the world, so to speak, with computers? And I think the answer is not. Um, well, let me just say my answer. Um, First, if you want to talk about social impact using tools from computer science, the problem, in my opinion, needs to be very specific because it's easy to get bogged down into philosophical discussions about what is right or what is wrong in society. But if you want to apply computers to it, then you want to be specific about what you are solving. And in my opinion, once I think about specific societal problems and how computers might apply to them, right? I find that a lot of them don't really have great technical solutions. There's a lot of cases where computers might be able to help, but the core of the solution needs to be from a human standpoint. The core of the solution needs to be non-technical. There's this nice term called techno-chauvinism, which is referring to the belief that tech solves any problem in society. I don't think that this holds. I think that if you care about addressing social problems, then it's less about applying computers to everything and more about being an active citizen, voting, participating in the broader social conversation, even if that's very stressful these days, things like that. That's how you address a lot of broader social problems that are outside of the realm of just computer science. As I say this, I want to say that you don't have to single mindedly devote your career to service to do social good. If you do this, what I've been told is that your goals become centered around this idea of social impact, but the actual social impact of your work depends on a lot of things that are outside of your control. Like, do politicians want to listen to you? Do um, people at companies want to incorporate these like socially beneficial things that you might suggest? And if you have these goals centered on social impact, it can lead to a lot of stress and frustration because you're setting goals that you don't 100% control. I think priority number one should be feed yourself. Priority number two, do things that excite you and that motivate you right now. You do not need to align everything to service, and you can do service outside of work. Again, being an active citizen, that's not necessarily that's not limited to, nor is it always in your work. Also, don't be a sucker because it's really, really easy to string young people along, especially young people who have very strong feelings about morality, um, in a way that exploits them. And often, what I see, or what I hear rather, is that um, what I've heard most is people who are very idealistic being pushed to work really, really hard past healthy limits as an obligation to their team or to the company or to some broader idea in a way that doesn't actually help much. Don't feel like your career or your work belongs solely to the idea of social good because you're still your own individual. You still deserve your own boundaries and your own ability to make choices that you want to make. And it's really easy for those people to be taken advantage of. Or rather, it's really easy for young people to take advantage of. So be careful about being taken advantage of if these are things you care about. Now, I do want to take one last aside here and talk about computer science and warfare because when I was in Poland, Poland is right next door to Ukraine, a lot of my students and a lot of my fellow faculty members were um, very concerned about this topic. My mentor, for example, he told me about how he has nightmares about an invasion of Poland and his family dying in the invasion and how that regularly keeps him up at night. He has a wife and a very small baby. Geopolitics seems to have been getting worse. I'm not a social scientist. I cannot say this super confidently, but it seems to be getting worse. If you look at the budgets for NATO countries, the defense spending has gone up significantly, particularly since the start of the war in Ukraine. And if you look at the wars in Ukraine and Gaza in particular, you see a lot of deployment of technology, some of it high tech, some of it just new tech compared to what we had before. And this will have knock on effects likely for future wars if they happen. And the question that I want you to consider is, what would you do if you were asked to build weapons as a computer scientist? If you are at a safe country, at a university that generally leans very liberal, then your immediate answer might be no. I would never build weapons. I believe that weapons make the world more violent and make it worse. And I think that's a very reasonable perspective. But conversely, if you are in Ukraine or you're in Poland and you are either actively fighting an invasion or you are very worried about one, then your immediate answer might actually be yes. And then in between, if you are very uncertain about what the future holds, then I think there's a lot of gray area. For example, if you are someone who cares a lot about Gaza, you might point out that technology in that war is very one sided, and if you are working on technology, you're really working for one side. Um, this is a sort of moral minefield, and it's really hard to have this conversation, but I think this is a really important one to have because of how things have become more violent in recent times. With that, I want to close out with a couple of last words. First, I want to say I'm really glad that I did the Fulbright. I'm really glad that I spent this year teaching in this small Polish university. It didn't do a lot for my resume. Like, when I was applying for jobs, people would see that and they would say, "Oh, that's interesting. Why would you do that?" And it didn't fit in super nicely with most of my stories, or like most of the stories that I was selling about myself, right? I think that's okay, and I am happy with that because I got a lot of personal growth out of it, even if I didn't get a lot of professional growth necessarily. And particularly for those of you who have spent a lot of time doing computer science and working really hard on computer science things, I want to push you to explore those other possibilities when you can. You may not be able to explore them immediately if you have financial needs or if you are restricted by visa things, but do don't feel trapped in computer science. It's good to expose yourself to other things, and you're worth more than just what you accomplish technically. There's this nice quote from this article with a great title from 2011. And basically, what this is getting at is, how do you know what you want to do with your life? And how do you know that that's coming from you and not from some wider outside pressure? It can be hard to determine this if you follow only the safe or only the popular options. And the way that you get to an answer faster is you take risks. You do things that seem crazy but you still want to do, and you do what you want to do in the moment, and as you sort of get that broader experience, you figure out something from there. Again, this all depends on your situation. Don't do anything that's gonna go against what you need financially or what you need just like with visa restrictions. But I would like you to keep this in mind if you can, to go against the grain. I also want to say I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do after college. As I mentioned before, Fulbright is doesn't fit very well with a lot of post college stories, and Fulbright was only going to be for a year. I didn't really know what I wanted to do after that. And it's definitely possible that I could be doing quote unquote better if I had done things more optimally, so to speak. And I think about that every now and then. I am in the start of my PhD. I've been dealing with a lot of imposter syndrome and a lot of I don't know what I'm doing syndrome. And that has been rough. And I think often, like, what if I had just, like, known what this is what I wanted to do at this point, and what if I had just, like, geared around that more optimally? But when I zoom out and think about everything that I have done, I am really happy with where I ended up. And I think, and it leads me to say that I don't think that what you do right now has to dictate how happy you are down the line. It's okay to be uncertain. It's okay to not know what you want to do when you're this early, when you're this young. There is a lot of time for you to do good things, knock on wood, hopefully. Um, there is a lot of time for you to explore and to figure out what you want to do with your life. I would also say don't oscillate too much on this. You do want to eventually find an answer. Um, you don't have to have a perfect answer, but most of the job possibilities, most of the things that you can do with computer science are hard. And at some point, you do need to buckle down and just figure it out. But it's okay if you don't know exactly what you want to do. Now, if you're interested in doing Fulbright, let me know. Usually, the teaching is for English only, but you have opportunities to study, do research, or teach, depending on what interests you most. And if you're interested in that, let me know. As well, as I mentioned before, I'm currently at UBC, and so if you're interested in attending UBC as a grad student, let me know and I can give you some pointers on that. I made my choice to go to UBC based on funding issues in the US. Whether or not this affects your field is I think, very grant specific, so you should talk with mentors or advisors about what the funding situation is in your field and see if going away from the US might be the correct option. That is all I have to say. Thank you for listening, or dzięki if you are a Polish speaker. My contact information is here, and yeah, that is that. Full recording, both halves, and yeah, thank you again for listening.